All right, today we're going to talk about Reconstruction. Reconstruction is the period immediately following the Civil War, and they call it Reconstruction because they were trying to restore the seceded states to the Union. Now, there were two different plans, as we're going to see. One was the Lincoln Plan, or also called the Presidential Plan, and as we're going to see, that obviously did not work out because President Lincoln did not survive. The other plan is the Congressional Reconstruction Plan, and we'll explain that as well. After the Civil War, there were three major issues. The first issue was, what are we going to do? This is just going in order of here, some of the things we're going to talk about. The first major issue was, what are we going to do with, how are we going to readmit those states? Okay, should the process be easy or hard? Should we treat the Confederates as equals, or should we treat them as fallen enemies? And that was the big question that surrounded, or dominated, I should say, the whole Reconstruction plan on both sides. The second issue was, how are we going to treat the white Confederates? Once again, are we going to treat those individuals as enemies, or are they just countrymen? And that became a major issue. And then the third one, how are we going to treat the former slaves? Okay, there are now 4 million freed slaves down south. How are they going to be treated? What are we going to help them? Are we going to take measures to make sure that the old slave laws and things don't fall back into place? Those are the questions that posed us. So the three major issues are: 1, readmitting Confederate states; 2, treatment of white Confederates; and 3, treatment of former slaves. Lincoln took the position of that the Southern states were in a state of rebellion, that they never left the Union. And by taking that position, it was easier for him to set a more lenient course of action as far as readmitting the states. Okay, he put his plan of Reconstruction into effect before the war was even over in areas occupied by the Union troops. Okay, the presidential plan, or Lincoln's plan, called for a full pardon for an oath. And Lincoln's plan provided for pardons to all Southerners, with some certain exceptions, especially war criminals, especially those that killed African Americans that were prisoners of war. But for all Southerners, even if you participated in the war, if you took an oath and gave a pledge of allegiance to the United States, you got a full pardon for your position during the war. 10% of voters from the 18th, so this goes back before the war started, 10% of voters from the 1860 election would have to take a vote for that state to be readmitted. So only 10% would have to take an oath. So that is a very, very easy way of trying to get the Confederate states back in. And they had a form of government guaranteed the abolition of slavery as well. So they also, if they were going to be readmitted, they had to follow along with the abolishment of slavery. Okay, so those were Lincoln's two things there. Full pardon for an oath, 10% of the voters take an oath, and the state's readmitted. So pretty simple in that aspect. Okay. Now the Congressional Plan, as we know, this is going to be led by the Radical Republicans. Okay, the Radical Republicans were led by a man named Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania. Also, a man named Charles Sumner. And if you remember Charles Sumner, he was very much so against slavery, and in fact was the man that was almost beaten to death in Congress for giving an anti-slavery speech. And so he's one of the radicals. And then also Senator Ben Wade from Ohio. Okay, they wanted to punish the South. That was their goal. Okay, they wanted to punish the South, treat them as war criminals, treat them as a conquered country. So when you're thinking radical Republicans, that's what I want you to think of. Think of punishing the South and conquering, or treating them as a conquered country. Okay. Now, the Wade Davis bill, also known as the Congressional Reconstruction Plan, basically went a little bit further and made it a lot more difficult for ex-Confederates and those states to be readmitted. Okay? In July of 1864, Congress passed their own Reconstruction Plan, very much stricter than Lincoln's. And number one, they were going to treat them as war criminals. Number two, I'm a little ahead of myself there. Number two, 50% had to take an oath to become a state. So 50% of the voting population had to take an oath to become a state. Now, still not 60 or 70%, but 50% is a big jump from Lincoln's 10%. And no Confederate veteran could vote. So basically, who is going to do the voting here? And that's the tricky part, okay? Because if no Confederate veteran could vote, most of the males that were in the South, if they were of anything even close to the voting age, they're going to be fighting. Okay, so women could not vote. So who's going to be doing the voting? The answer is the former slaves. Okay, and that is going to really incite the former Confederates and the people down south, because now their future is going to be determined by these former slaves. Lincoln will veto the bill. Okay, well, there we go. But it's really, at that point, the radical Republicans had a lot of power. Okay, so Lincoln vetoes it. He actually lets it die in a pocket veto. Basically, he has 10 days to act on that, and if he signs, or it could be signed into law, or there's also called a stamp veto, which is a more prominent way of vetoing a bill. But Lincoln here, if they went in, they adjourned, so it kind of just died out on their own. So that's called a pocket veto. In April of 65, as we know, Lincoln is assassinated, and Andrew Johnson announces that he will follow Lincoln's plan. Okay, now, just looking at this page here, there's a few things that are different about Johnson. First of all, as we know, Lincoln was a Republican. Johnson was his vice president. And if you look what party he was a Democrat. Okay? Something else that sticks out, where is he from? North Carolina. He's from the South. So Lincoln actually chose him to be vice president to try to bring the South together, figuring that the war was just about over. This would make things a little bit easier, but in actuality, it's going to actually backfire on him. Okay? There's going to be some things that Johnson does that really, number one, he's a Democrat, so the radical Republicans aren't going to like him. And number two, he's from the South. Now, if you're from the South, you're looking at Andrew Johnson as almost a traitor as well. So we're going to see that he's not going to be a very popular vice president. He will actually, at the start of the war, he was actually a senator from Tennessee and did not support the secession. So that made him very unpopular. And then he will actually become the military governor of Tennessee after the Union soldiers come back in 1864. So it's going to be kind of a bad position that Andrew Johnson's in. Okay, the condition in the South was absolutely terrible during this time. We've talked about, or you actually have learned of Sherman's March. There were 9,000 miles of railroad track were destroyed, and we talked about Sherman's neckties or railroad ties where he tied them around a tree. Property values dropped so much there was basically no money anymore. The Confederate money that they all used is worthless. A third of the livestock was destroyed, and basically 20% of the adult white male population is gone. Okay, so things are really, really bad in the South. So he's going to try to follow Lincoln's plan, and as we're going to see, he's not going to have a lot of power in this. Okay. There we go about the South's conditions. Well, with the South being so bad off, some of the radical Republicans wanted to start what's called the Freemans Bureau. Okay, the Freemans Bureau was created to give help to former slaves and white refugees. And the help we're looking at is jobs, food, shelter, education, things that that did not exist. Okay, in the North resented this. They saw it as a charity to their former traitors. So we're going to help the people that almost destroyed our country. So that wasn't very popular in the North. In the South, they saw it as a plan to try to split the South even further, with trying to help the freed slaves and making them more powerful. And that became more and more of a problem too. Rumors actually went around, and this was actually called Special Order 15, that each freed slave family were going to get 40 acres of land and a mule. Well, where's that land going to come from? Well, that comes from the Confederates, the white Confederates that own this land. Their land's going to be taken from them. Well, this never happens, okay? But the rumors were flying around that this was going to happen, so that made things even worse, especially for the Freedmen's Bureau. So the reaction there was very split. So, and this is actually a thing that appeared in the paper. Obviously, it is portraying the freed slave as somebody just sitting around, as all of the, if you look in the background, white people are working hard. Basically, that they're getting a free ride for what occurred. So, not a very popular move by the radical Republicans. Okay. And there it is there, North type of charity, South resented it, planned to split the South. Now the Carpetbaggers were Northern politicians looking for power, and they're going to try to get this power because they're going to use the voting capability of the freed slaves. Okay, basically according to the congressional plan, the white males can't vote. If they participated in the war, they can't vote. So the freed slaves are going to get this vote. Many of these guys were very dishonest. They were there trying to extend their own power. They were called carpetbaggers because they carried some of their belongings in suitcases made of carpet material. That's how they got the name. They grew rich by taking advantage of the freed slaves, and a lot of corruption and bribery. So you have the Carpetbaggers in down south, and that name is still used today, and not as powerful, but is still used today. Another one, Scalawags. Okay, you may have heard this word before. These are Southern people that actually helped the Carpetbaggers during this time, and they were doing it for their own, trying to get rich as well. But they were trying to help the Carpetbaggers, and basically they were called Scalawags, or Southern dissenters. So that was not a name you wanted to be called as well, but that's how they held very little respect for people that helped the Carpetbaggers. Well, part of this as well is called the Black Codes. And the black codes are basically, these are going to be laws that are going to be set up to replace the old slave laws in the South. You know, slavery is dead in the South. Slavery has been abolished. There are no slaves. However, the Confederates, or the white population, and not the majority, but there are some people that put forth these slave laws to try to control the freed slave population now. They wanted to keep things status quo antebellum, meaning the same before the war. Okay. They forced the freed slaves, they had to work for white men. Okay. They were called apprentices. So they were working, and they're getting paid, but they had to work for white men. They could not gather in large groups without the presence of a white man. They were not allowed mobility. They couldn't move. They couldn't just move around in any way they wanted to. They were not allowed to possess firearms. So very similar to the slave codes that were in existence during slavery. And, that was the whole point. You got to remember that, the slaves were basically under control of all these white people for so long that a big population of the people that did own slaves were a little nervous that perhaps there was going to be retaliation. You can see that in these black codes. So once again, these laws were not supposed to be there, but they are. Okay, these aren't in the Constitution or anything like that, but these are results of this Reconstruction plan. Oh, there was also a curfew. I forgot to mention that one. In 1865, there was a Civil Rights Act. And in that Civil Rights Act, they were going to try to pass this Civil Rights Act. President Johnson will actually veto it. The Congress will override it. Basically, it was passed to nullify the black codes. Johnson vetoes it mainly not because he was against the Civil Rights Act. It was just there was really no way to enforce it. And even though this act was passed, it was never enforced anyway. So, the black codes will stay in existence. We'll talk about those later on in the South, and for a long time, in fact. Not as maybe a law in the books or anything like that, but they will still be there in existence. So lots of problems in the South created by this. So hopefully you're getting the idea that Lincoln's plan was so much different than the Congress's plan, and Lincoln's death, probably, even though John Wilkes Booth was trying to save the South, but in fact, it actually probably hurt the South even more, because if we would have followed Lincoln's plan, things would have been a lot easier for the South to be readmitted. Maybe there wouldn't have been so many problems involved with that. And I'm a big what if guy. So what if John Wilkes Booth did not kill Lincoln? Would his plan have worked? Would it have made it easier for the nation to come together? Would there be less hard feelings? So those are the questions you got to ask yourself. Okay, that is Reconstruction Part 1.